Should I?
Yep.
Okay, so we are live. Right, well, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm very excited to welcome Daniel Lakens today to speak. But before we get on to that, I just need to do a few quick announcements. On my screen here on the left, you can see all the upcoming speakers from now until the end of July. And one event that I just want to draw everybody's attention to, if you haven't seen it already, is the conference that we have on the 11th of June. It looks like it's going to be a highly subscribed conference. It's at the minute we have 900 signups, and so we'll probably be reaching the 1,000 mark. So we'll get a lot of questions being asked in the Q&A, and it'd be nice to see the attendees' thoughts as well as the thoughts of the speakers. So please do join. Everything will be recorded and links will be distributed closer to the time. So with those announcements done, I will just quickly move on to introducing our speaker for today. Although I don't necessarily see the point of introducing Daniel. Daniel is probably known to everybody in open science, the open research movement. But I will give an introduction anyhow. So Daniel is based in the Netherlands. He's based at the Human Technology Interaction Group at Eindhoven University of Technology. His research focuses on how to design and interpret studies, meta-research, reward structures in science. Danny's probably most noted for his huge contributions in skills training. His Coursera course, I'm one of the people that, one of the many thousands that have been on that course. It's a brilliant course, and also the updated one too that was released quite recently. Daniel is very prolific, and he's done several research projects covering a whole range of subjects in meta research. My favourite, and one that I've sort of pinched from him, is to look at the reproducibility of meta-analyses, which is a fascinating area of research that's not really discussed. And Daniel is going to give a talk today that's looking at the risk of replacing old norms with new norms, but without any sort of being sensitive to the fact that we could just be repeating and regurgitating what we've done before. So Daniel, I'm going to hand it over to you. I believe you have your desktop already, and you're good to go. Okay, so I'll switch off.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks for having me over virtually for this meeting. I thought would be nice to talk about something that interests me. So as somebody working on how to improve science, one of the main things that we try to do is get people to incorporate better research practices. And now we've had some experience in this in psychology. I think we've been working on improving the way that people do research for about a decade. So we can look back a little bit of how we're doing this and what we're doing well and what we could improve. And one of the things I think is worth considering is the way that people are adopting certain practices, if these are based on good decisions that these reforms are good for them and will improve their research, or whether they might be doing these things just because they think they should be doing them. So more norm-based, basically. There's this nice quote by Berkeley. It's from 1735, but it's, I think, still relevant. It still applies to science nowadays. Let me read it out for you. So it says, "Men learn the elements of science from others, and every learner has a deference, more or less, to authority. Especially young learners," so maybe many of you listening here, "few of that kind, caring to dwell long upon principles, but inclining rather to take them up on trust. And things early admitted by repetition become familiar, and this familiarity at length passeth for evidence." So this is really a statement about how we learn how to do science. And we have to take some things on trust, I think, so there's a trade-off, and we'll talk about it a little bit. But also there's a deference more or less to authority that Berkeley is noticing. And I think this happens a lot as well. Now, personally, I was brought up in a very anti-authoritarian way. My parents were not big fans of authority in general, and when I was a teenager, I went through a bit of a punk phase where this is a quote by a punk band from the UK called Cross, and they have an album where they say that there is no authority but yourself. So I think personally, I'm always been a bit inspired by this idea of not trusting others to tell you what to do. Right, you have to figure out what to do yourself, and I think science, could do maybe a little bit with a bit more of a punk attitude in this way, not trusting authority so much like Berkeley mentions, but really trying to make your own decisions. So I think the main point that I would like to discuss is that I think what we're doing now in terms of scientific reform, however you want to call it, but I think we're trying to make sure that people do a slightly better job in their research. And I have the feeling that the scientific reform will fail if all we do is create new leaders, people who are authority figures, who will tell other people what the new norms are and how they are supposed to behave. And I think we need to carefully consider if this is maybe what we're doing, and maybe that's not what we want to end up with. I would prefer it if that's not what we end up with. So it's important to try to be critical, maybe also of the people who are trying to be critical of other people, right? So this is a bit of a tricky thing. It's a never-ending cycle, but we should definitely be critical, not just of people who did research in the past, but also be critical of now people who are trying to be critical of how people did research in the past. I think that's a healthy attitude. So let me start by a question. I can't see any answers, so let's just make it a mental question, right? That you ask yourself. Take a moment to think, why are we using an alpha level of 0.05? If we do research, if we do a hypothesis test, where does this alpha level of 0.05 come from? And well, maybe you don't really know. That would be fine. Maybe nobody told you. It might be just one of these things that, as Berkeley mentioned in 1735, it's one of those things that you see, and you see it based on repetition again and again. Everybody seems to do this, and after seeing this a lot of time, it becomes familiar, and we start to trust this, and we think, well, this is what we do because this is what we do. And I think a lot of our justifications of why we do certain things in science are really based only on this. Like, well, this is what we do because this is what we do. So maybe my goal of today is a little bit to challenge this kind of assumption. What we can do is, of course, treat it in one of two ways. So one is, this is not just a norm, but this is some sort of godly prescription, right? Like this is Moses who came down from Mount Sinai, and he had the 10 commandments, and this is just something that's ordered for all of us to do. An alpha level of 0.05. That is what you will use for the rest of your life. But that's actually not how it was, also not originally. So it's not like somebody wrote a Bible and said, this is a commandment, you have to follow this. It's interesting to read some of these classics. People rarely do them, but if we read Neyman and Pearson, and this is in 1933, and this is really the first time that they wrote a paper where they proposed their view on hypothesis testing, where we have these two types of errors that we can make. Type 1 error, we can say that there is an effect when we are actually wrong and nothing was going on. Or a type 2 error, so we can say, no, nothing seems to be going on here, but we were wrong. And there was actually a true effect that we could have found. And they say about this, whatever conclusion is reached, the following position must be recognized. If we reject the null hypothesis, we may reject it when it's true. If we accept the null hypothesis, we may be accepting it when it's false. That is to say, when some alternative hypothesis is true. These two sources of errors can rarely be eliminated completely. And then they say, in some cases, it will be more important to avoid the first, in others, the second. So I'm not saying that any of these is more important overall. They then discuss a problem Laplace raised by thinking about sending somebody to jail or not. Right? Is it more important if you send somebody who's innocent to prison, or do you want to err on the side where you let somebody go even though they actually committed the crime? And in the end, they have a statement that I really like, because these are statisticians and you don't have this insight very often among statisticians. And this is an important point. The use of these statistical tools in any given case in determining just how the balance should be struck must be left to the investigator. Right? They're not telling you what to do. They are making sure that you know that you have to make this trade-off, but how you make it, that is up to you. So that's very different than how it's used nowadays. So what does this paper do? I think this paper gives thoughtful advice on what you should do, namely balance how bad is the one versus the other, think about this, and then decide where you want to place these error rates. The consequence is nobody follows this advice, right? Nobody does this. It was too thoughtful, too nuanced. Nowadays, we still try to make people think about the same topic. It hasn't stopped. It's almost a century since they wrote their paper, but now we say, okay, maybe we've been a bit too loose on our alpha level. We see that replication rates are not as high as we would like them to be, so what can we do about this? And this is a quote from a paper by Benjamin et al., and they make the recommendation to lower the alpha level to 0.005. So we become much more strict. Now, this proposal is nothing new, and they admit this. It's been proposed many times before. But there is something new about it, and this is the highlighted part. Let me read this. So while statisticians have known the relative weaknesses of using a p equals 0.05 as a threshold for discovery, and the proposal to lower it to 0.005 is not new, a critical mass of researchers now endorse this change. And that's peculiar, right? So they're not really saying, I mean, they have some arguments for it in the paper, which, you know, might be more or less relevant to your research. But this is very peculiar. Why do they feel the need to say a critical mass of researchers now endorse this change? And it is because they're trying to establish a new norm. This is a paper that was written by more than 70 authors. You don't really need that many authors to write a paper. What they really want to do is say, look, all these prestigious researchers are thinking that this is the way to go. All right, so it's an approach we can try to use, of course. So I think this approach is nevertheless problematic, right? Saying that a critical mass of people thinks something is a good idea is trying to establish a new norm, and that's fine, right? But this approach is really targeting people at a way where they say, okay, well, we're now trying to just establish a new norm. Whether you think this is the best thing to do or not might not be very relevant. Let's just try to push for this new norm. It's interesting that actually no one also follows this advice. I mean, the paper's been out there for a couple of years. Maybe no one is exaggeration. I mean, the paper is cited a lot, but I don't think a lot of alpha levels have moved to 0.005. It's interesting to ask why not. I'm not completely sure. I mean, there might be many reasons for it, but I think one reason is that there were actually a number of people critical of this viewpoint. There was discussion back and forth, and as it goes, these discussions become way too polarized. Nobody really knows what to think about something. And I think one of the main reasons it didn't work in the end is that, well, the justifications for it weren't clearly communicated. The idea that we should do this as a sort of norm, new norm was. But then if there's debate, you know, I mean, we know from psychology, from psychological literature, that if you want to have an authority make people do something, you can think of the studies by Milgram, for example, you don't need two experimenters or two persons in the lab who are fighting among each other. If one person says it's essential for the experiment that you continue to do this, then you can move people's behavior. But if then another person comes in and says, wait, is this really a good idea? Should we be giving people electrical shocks? And they start to fight with each other, then following authorities drops considerably. And I think that might have happened here in this case as well. There are some good ways to do this, actually. I have to think about this based on, let's say, more basic principles. This is, I think, a very lovely study from ecology. I'm just putting it out here if you want to read up on this. Because actually they say, well, you know, yeah, you have to weigh the costs and the benefits. There is literature on how to do this well. And in this case, they have a nice example of koala bears where they weigh the costs and the benefits of monitoring whether the koala population declines over time. And they say, well, if we would miss a decline in the koala population, the consequences would be so severe, we should just set the alpha level to 1. We should always assume that the koala population is declining. We should always intervene actively, because if we miss it, costs are way too high. So just always implement the intervention. So you don't even have to do the experiment sometimes, right? So an alpha level of 1 can be justified if you want to. Now let me ask another question, a follow-up question. Why do we recommend to aim for a statistical power of at least 80%? And I'm pretty sure that many of you listening to this, if you design a hypothesis test, and nowadays maybe more than ever, because now you have to perform maybe a power analysis or at least have a simple size justification, many of you will know this minimum boundary of 80% power. So this is your type 2 error rate of 20%, right? So I wonder if you know why. Why are we saying that 80% is the good minimum threshold? You know, you have any idea? If you do this practice, can you justify it for yourself? Do you know why you're doing this? Or are you wondering, I'm actually not completely sure, but somebody told me that this is a good thing to do, and I'm just listening to this other person telling me what to do. It might be that the latter is the case. So again, let's go back and actually read the literature on this. It's not too hard. This is from a book by Cohen. This is the second edition, 1988. The book is from 1964 or something, I think. The first draft or 68, something like this. But he writes in this book, it is proposed here as a convention, right? We're talking about a convention, that when the investigator has no other basis for setting the desired power value, a value of 80% is used. This means that the type 2 error rate is set at 20%. This arbitrary but reasonable value is offered for several reasons. You can look up Cohen, 1965. There are no reasons in Cohen, 1965, no good reasons. The chief among them takes into consideration the implicit convention of an alpha level of 5%. Oh yeah, all right, so we have the convention of setting an alpha level to 5%, which itself was never intended to be done. And now we are building a norm upon this previous norm, because the type 2 error rate of 20% is chosen with the idea that the general relative seriousness of these two kinds of errors is in the order of 0.20 to 0.5%, so that a type 1 error is about 4 times as serious as a type 2 error. That's it. Why is a type 1 error 4 times as serious as a type 2 error? There's no reason for it. And then he says something that's also interesting. This 80% desired power convention is offered with the hope that it will be ignored whenever an investigator can find in his substantive concerns and his specific research investigation to choose a value ad hoc. So you're supposed to ignore this and come up with something better, but only if you don't manage after trying, then you can maybe try this 80%, right? This proposes a new norm that's based on an old norm. I would say that's probably bad practice. We don't want to build norms upon norms upon norms, and nothing is based on any real justification in the end. However, everybody follows this advice. I think that's a peculiar way to do science. So we can ask ourselves, why do scientists set error rates that don't reflect the rate at which they actually want to make errors? And I think the reason is clear. It's just because we follow norms. We don't follow rational justifications for anything. Just to be clear, this is not a problem with null hypothesis significance testing, which is done rather mindlessly. I completely agree. I might be one of the few people left in the world who actually think that a p-value is not the most horrible thing out there as a statistical tool, but it might have some use. But if you look at how people use Bayes factors, which have been proposed as an alternative way to do statistical inferences, and if you look at the priors that people use, then everybody uses default priors. Right? They also don't think about their prior, which might be a much more substantial thing to mindlessly incorporate in your statistical analysis. So it's not really a problem of any statistical approach. The problem goes much deeper than this. I want to point out one other thing that is a norm that we accept, which I think we should call into question. And there are many other things we can do, and you can probably come up with some. If you have some nice examples, by all means, put them in the Q&A. And I'm happy to learn about things that are that you think are mindless norms in your field. But this is a quote that I really like by Charles Babbage. It's from 1830, and it's about reflections on the decline of science in England. So according to Charles Babbage, sort of one of the people who came up with computers, early work on computers. It was an uncle of Ada Lovelace. So he was already thinking in 1813 that science was declining. And he describes one practice that he thinks is especially problematic, and he calls this cooking. This is an art of various forms, the object of which is to give to ordinary observations the appearance and character of those of the highest degree of accuracy. One of its numerous processes is to make multitudes of observations, and out of these to select only which agree or very nearly agree. So with your prediction, right? You have some prediction and you only cherry pick those things that match what you predicted. If 100 observations are made, the cook must be very unlucky if he cannot pick out 15 or 20 that will do up for serving. So this is selective reporting, or however we nowadays call this. We know people still do this nowadays as well. We selectively report the things that work. Mixed results and non-significant results are less likely to be written up. We know this based on meta-scientific work. This is a nice study by Franco and colleagues, where they just looked at a grant where people were given the opportunity to collect representative data, nationally representative data. They can write in a grant and say, hey, I would like to, get the resources to collect this representative sample. They looked at the people who got this grant, And then they called them later up and they said, so what did you do with the results? We know that you collected the data, right? We can tell because that's what you got the money for. So the data was collected. What did you do with it? And then you'll see from this table, they distinguish between whether there were no results, mixed results, or strong results. You see for the strong results, 56 of them are published, 31 are unpublished but written up, maybe undergoing the peer review process. For no results, the story is very different. 31 of them are not only unpublished, but also not even written up. So the scientists didn't even bother to try to get them published. At the same time, logically, if we look at the scientific literature, we know that significant studies should be expected. Now, of course, if you design a study, you have to aim for 80% power, right? Clear. You have to aim for 80% power. So if you do this, you manage to do this in 3 studies in a row, what's the probability that all studies will work out, have a significant result? Well, it's 80% for the first study, multiplied by 80 for the second, multiplied by 80 for the third. We get to about 50% of studies, 3 study papers that have exclusively significant results if they aimed for 80% power and got 80% power. This is, of course, not what you see if you look at the scientific literature. We also know that if you ask people to pre-register their study in a registered report, so the paper is accepted before the data is collected, or in principle acceptance, right? If you follow through this with this plan, we will publish your result. If we look at the subset of these studies where publication bias is no longer an issue, we see that it's not that everybody just studies things that are true all the time. No, there are no results. The normal literature has about 96% significant predictions in their papers. So they predicted something 96% of the time in these papers. This is relatively recent data. 96% of the time they find what they're looking for, but in registered report, this doesn't happen. And there the number is about 46% of the time. So there are no results out there. We just don't share them normally in the standard literature. We can also ask people, like, have you done this? And 40% will say, yeah, and at least once I've selectively reported the analysis that worked. Yeah. Now, an interesting study by Pickett and Roche asked the general public, what do you think about this? What do you think about a scientist who selectively reports analyses that worked? And then these people say, well, I think this is actually highly unethical. This is immoral behavior. And 50% of Americans who filled out this questionnaire said, well, a scientist who selectively reports only what works should probably be fired. And I like this. I mean, I'm not saying that people should get fired because, as we see, a lot of people have done this. So this would mean that we would really have to fire more than half of the scientists, maybe. So that I'm not suggesting. But I like that there is this huge divergence between what we think is okay and what we will even self-admit that we do. And then if you go on the street, you just ask a random person, what do you think about scientists do this? They say, well, it seems to make sense to me that you should fire somebody who does this. So there's a big difference. And I think this big difference is, again, due to the norms. People are acculturated into science. We educate them about this is the way we do it because this is the way we do it. Of course, we don't publish our no results. But then if you go outside of science, you leave this bubble, people say, this is crazy. How can you do this? So again, you might wonder, why do we violate the code of research integrity in a way that the general public thinks should actually get us fired, right? It's an interesting question to ask. And again, I think the only reason is norms. By all means, point out a good reason why to selectively report research results, only if they work out, right? Only if they support your predictions. But I think there can be no good justification for this. So now we have scientific reform, and this will magically make everything better, right? Or maybe not. Let me give you 2 examples of practices. Again, just like I gave you 2 of these old norms that were wrong. And I think the new norms have the risk of not really improving anything. So I often get emails from people that say, well, you know, we're going through the editorial process, and I have the feeling this editor read up a little bit about suggestions in the reform literature, but maybe not doing everything as good as it can. And this is logical, right? So science is like a pendulum, sort of swings back and forth, and we were maybe a bit too loose, and now the risk is, of course, we're going to swing to the other side and become a little bit too strict. And this is not a problem if you would just follow rational arguments from basic principles, but it is if you're just sort of figuring out what should we be doing, I'm not completely sure, then there's the risk that you become too extreme. So this is an example of somebody that emailed me and said, okay, so we had an editor at the prestigious journal and they rejected our paper because they said you need at least 250 participants. We know this now. You need at least 250 participants in your study because otherwise your data is not reliable enough. This is a new mistaken norm. Let us again do what we did before. Let's read the original research and figure out where this norm is coming from. There's a very nice paper by Felix Schonbrot and Marco Perugini. I like the paper, where they say at a certain moment, if table 1 should be boiled down to simple answers, for typical research scenarios, reasonable trade-offs between accuracy and confidence start to be achieved when n approaches 250. So this is clearly where this number is coming from, right? Somebody said in this paper, they said, well, under certain assumptions, 250 sample size would be a good idea. And this editor remembered this. Now let's take a look at table 1. So this is table 1, and we see that there's, depending on the effect size, every row in this table is a different effect size. There are 3 subsections based on the level of confidence you want to have about the stability of your estimate. And then there's a certain width of the accuracy of the estimate that you specify. So there are 3 parameters that go into this table. Given any of the choices here, the number that is recommended is anywhere between 20 and 470. And of course, if they have to boil it down to a simple recommendation, yeah, maybe the number 250 is sensible, but it really depends where you fall on these scales, which accuracy you want to achieve or can achieve in your research. So I would say if you have to summarize table 1 and you have to boil it down to a simple answer, the simple answer is actually not 250. The simple answer is it depends. It depends. But people are highly allergic to the answer, it depends. That makes sense. If I tell you, you come to me with a question, you say, what should I do? And I tell you, it depends. I understand. You don't like this. You don't want to be told it depends. You want to get an answer. Probably the review process forced these authors, who otherwise wrote very nuanced statements about what to do, to at least give a practical, simple recommendation. So we tell people this because that's what they want, but the correct answer should be it depends. That's not too difficult. It's not too negative. It depends on the effect size, the desired accuracy, and the desired confidence that you want. 3 things. And you can learn about these 3 things. You don't have to do the simple thing, n is 250. You can think about these 3 things, learn where you are on these 3 scales, basically, what's relevant in your specific situation, and make an informed judgment about what to do. Another thing I wanted to mention as a new mistaken norm is that you have to pre-register your studies. This is also a quote that somebody told me that they had heard at a sort of, from a senior academic who gave them career advice. Lovely. Pre-register your studies because that's what the journals want to see. So this is really just jump through this hoop because that's what you have to do, right? You have to do this because you have to do this nowadays. I should say this is a mistaken norm. There's a lot of discussion about the use and value of pre-registration. Many of it, I have to say, not very good because people don't even define what pre-registration is supposed to be. What most papers about pre-registration do is say somewhere, pre-registration is a practice where you write down your design and your analysis beforehand. But that's not a definition of what pre-registration is for, or the goals it aims to achieve. That is a description of a practice, right? And of course, you get a lot of debates about whether this practice is useful or not because there's no good conceptual definition. So often I hope that somebody else will fix this, and you wait a couple of years and nobody fixes it. So I wrote a paper on this recently, and I think this is a pretty good definition of the value of pre-registration, right? I mean, by all means, criticize it. It would be lovely to be pointed out that this is wrong, but as far as I can see, this is pretty decent approach. So here I write, pre-registration adds value for people who, based on their philosophy of science, increase their trust in claims that are supported by severe tests and predictive successes. Pre-registration itself doesn't make a study better or worse compared to a non-pre-registered study. So asking for it by default doesn't make a lot of sense. It depends on what you want to do. And instead, what it does is that it merely allows researchers to transparently evaluate the severity of a test. That's what it does. You tested the claim. How severely did you test this? An example of not severely testing a claim is making up the prediction after having collected the data, because, well, if I already know what the data is, I can already make a prediction that perfectly matches, right? So it's not a severe test. I can't be wrong if I come up with the prediction after the fact. So that's an example of a non-severe test. So this means that if this is the goal of pre-registration, it means that getting a badge a pre-registered badge that some people now get, it doesn't mean you did a good study, right? That's not the definition of pre-registration. It's not good. It means that people can now evaluate the severity of the reported tests. And this evaluation can be rather negative, of course. I can now look at what you've done, and then I can say, no, I don't think this is really good. I would recommend trying this once. Try to criticize somebody who did a study that was pre-registered. And very often the reply is something like, really? You're now even going to criticize studies that got a pre-registration badge because they jumped through all the hoops that you threw up over the last years, and even now it's not good enough? Yeah, I mean, there wasn't a hoop. You had to do something with a specific goal, right? And I understand that you're insulted by criticism if you adhere to the norms, because that feels unfair. You're like, hey, we followed the norms, but it was never about following the norms, at least not for me. Okay, so maybe to summarize, I think instead of telling people how to do good science, we should teach them to justify what they consider to be good science. I'm not interested if you followed anybody else's recommendations. I'm interested in if you can tell me why you think that this is a good approach to something. So I have this summarized in an easy-to-use hashtag that you can use in your social media communication, which is justify everything. Right? The question simply is justify all of your choices and assumptions. Well, you know, how difficult can that be? Okay, so I understand, practically speaking, this is slightly difficult, right? It's good to be able to justify everything, except the problem is you won't live long enough to figure out everything that you need to figure out to make informed judgments and choices about all the things you need to make choices about before you design a study. Right? You might be doing a PhD. You have a couple of years for this. You have to do a couple of studies. So yeah, maybe you can spend 6 months on something. But if just the choice of an alpha level, oh, you have to justify your alpha level. If that would take you 6 months of reading and thinking before you can do it, you're not going to do it because it's one of the 50 choices you need to make, right? So completely understand that these kind of time limitations also limit how well you can justify certain things. I think we can make things easier, right? So it doesn't take so much time, but still takes some time. So you might wonder, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, if you're forced to work in a small team where only a few people contribute to making these decisions and everybody just lives a normal lifespan, the small team will lack knowledge to do the best possible science. We just don't have the time to figure everything out, right? And I think many PhD projects, for example, are like this. We have this weird idea that we have to let a PhD student do research relatively independently instead of a large collaboration with 200 other people. No, they have to figure out their own little route and thing and figure out their own research. So, you know, I think sometimes academia seems to be quite obsessed with an idea of imposter syndrome. I'm not competent to talk about the causes for this, but what I think is at least what we also need is some realization that we are incompetent about many things that we nevertheless need to make decisions about. And it's just because it's very difficult to be an expert in all these things. So if you're forced to work in a very small team, I think, yeah, you have to just say, okay, some things just don't know enough about. Collaboration, I think, would solve many of these problems, right? Not just lack of expertise, because, you know, in collaboration, people can specialize. They can spend a couple of years on a tiny thing, and then we put all these people together, and then they can make all these decisions, right? But this collaboration approach to science is not rewarded specifically, so we don't really do it. I mean, we should work towards it, I think, but at the moment it's difficult. So what then? Yeah, what did you expect after this talk? That I'm going to tell you what to do? No, I mean, there is no authority. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You yourself need to figure out what to do, right? I'm just pointing out the problem, and I know it's unsatisfactory. I can tell you what I do, right? So what I try to do is I try to figure out at least the first 20% of things, which doesn't make me an expert in anything, but it gets me pretty far, right? This is based on the Pareto principle, where the first 20% that you learn gives you the 80% of understanding things. You're by far not an expert, but you're unlikely to mess up in the biggest possible ways. So it's closer to a good approach. For the rest, I often ask for help, right? Even if I don't have collaborators, I will ask academic Twitter, for example, for advice. Beyond this, I expect that most of the things I do are wrong. I'm now working on a study where we're going to do a questionnaire, and I'm completely clueless about questionnaires and measuring things in questionnaires. So we try, but I don't expect this to be very good, right? We try the best we can, but it's definitely not ideal. In the case you want to collaborate and you have survey expertise, by all means, reach out. And I try to invite criticism before it's too late, right? So this idea that I have that most of the stuff I do is wrong anyway makes it very easy to ask people, well, you know, if you can point out how I'm wrong and then help me improve, that would be very, very appreciated. I do have some advice, if you want some advice, which of course you're free to ignore. I would say that first, especially if you start in science, if you're an early career researcher, it makes sense. Don't expect that other people know what they're doing. It took me personally way too long to figure this out. I always thought people know what they're doing somewhere, but I don't think this is true. But people often don't admit it. We see it as sort of a science weakness, that we don't know what we're doing most of the time, maybe, right? But I think it is reality. The second thing I would recommend is just ask why sometimes. Don't go with this is what we do because this is what we do. Just ask why, like a 5-year-old, about everything, at least once, right? So just say, so why do we actually have this? And it can be a very good starting point for a discussion, and you might even ask other people for advice or read an old paper where something is explained. All right, thanks for the attention. That was what I wanted to say. Let's see if I can find you somewhere.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. That was a wonderful talk. I'm just looking at the Twitter feed, and there's a lot of people really engaged and enjoying the slides.
Thanks.
What we can do is, so I think just for everybody listening, Daniel is open to take questions now, and we have a good chunk of 25 minutes of his time left. So we have a Q&A option just on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can see a few questions there already, and you can just upvote any questions that you would like to ask, and this will make sure that we can prioritize those. But we could just sift them through in sort of first come first served basis for the time being. And so we'll start with the first question. Although I think it's more of a comment, is somebody said that another minus heuristic is n per cell or n per experiment when power depends on design and likely effect size. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Well, I think it's interesting that in one of the earlier papers about what to do for these problems, a very nice paper about false positive psychology, in this paper, if you see, they point out some of the problems, what we shouldn't do, and we shouldn't be too flexible in our data analysis and b-hack and those kind of things. And then there's a couple of recommendations. And one of the recommendations is, I think, use at least a sample size of n is 20. And then later, the same authors did some research. This is Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson and Leif Nelson. They did some other research, and they said, well, actually, we did some other studies. And when we look at some expected effect sizes, realistically, we're saying maybe have 50 participants per cell. And I think this is also a good example of a claim that maybe people used in the beginning, or maybe still use, right? If you look at the sample size justifications, there might be some people who say, well, look, this paper told us to do 50 per cell, so we are doing 50 per cell. But what this person is saying is completely right. It's a heuristic, and all heuristics are almost always wrong. And so it's easy to have this heuristic, and it takes a lot of time to teach people to do power analysis, right? I mean, I understand it's not easy, and for more complex designs, it becomes really complex. At the same time, that is the best approach. Sometimes the 50% might be too much, very rare, but you might study something like the Stroop effect or something, then you don't need them. But most of the time, it will still be much too small as a sample size per cell. So yeah, I would even go on a slightly more meta level and say that a power analysis itself is only one way to justify your sample size, and nobody is telling you to do a power analysis. Some people did, right? So if I would have taken more time, another thing that I've heard as feedback on a grant proposal is that somebody received the feedback that said, well, you didn't perform a power analysis, so your study designs are flawed, and they got a more negative evaluation for their grant proposal. Which I guess somebody was trying to do a good job, right? They thought, hey, we've heard so much about having to do power analysis, and underpowered research is a big problem, except for the fact that they had written up that they were looking at the accuracy of estimates, and they would first do some small studies to estimate the standard deviation, and then perform studies that would have accurate estimates based on this, which is a valid approach. They even wrote this together with a statistician. No, it's not a power analysis. They were not looking at, do I have enough observations to make this significant or not. They didn't care about significance per se. They wanted an accurate estimate. So they planned for accuracy, which is also perfectly fine. And at the same time, we see that, yeah, people think, okay, you have to do a power analysis. You have to have this number per cell. And these are all risky heuristics.
Wonderful. Okay, there are a few more questions filtering in. A few have been upvoted. So the next one was, so I'll read it out to you. So do people selectively publish because of norms, or because it is A, difficult to publish non-significant data due to editors' reviewers, and B, trying to publish non-significant work, which takes more time and is less likely to be accepted, is detrimental to one's career pathway?
Yeah. So the question is maybe what is a norm in this sense? And when I mentioned norms, I mean the norm as in we accept certain things, right? We accept certain things, and this involves as part of this, we accept the justification not to write up non-significant results because it might be problematic for your career, right? It doesn't, it's not the best way to spend your career. This might be very well-intentioned advice, right? It definitely might be true that writing up null results are not as exciting or interesting, even though you would prevent a few other people from studying the same thing and making the same mistake, or even helping a future meta-analysis to be actually a bit more accurate in their effect size estimate. That's not in your personal benefit, and we accept this. We accept that people say no, you know, and also we accept that it's difficult to publish. When I talk about norms, I really mean in a way that you would not just say, yeah, but these are all valid reasons not to do this, right? No, all of these are invalid reasons not to publish non-significant results. They are all you can't justify them in any way. And these people on the street that say you should be fired for this really have a point. So I'm really talking about the level of the norm where we as a scientific community accept this. And I understand that individuals make decisions based on their own personal cost-benefit analysis, or even like, well, what can I do, right? But there are many cases where we don't say to people, well, someone else told you to do unethical behavior, so you're not, you're excused now. That's a good reason for you to ignore this. We don't accept this in many fields. If I tell you to steal something, that's not, and you go to a judge, you're still an accomplice at the very least, right? And you still go to jail. So we don't accept these kind of things in other fields. I think it's weird that we accept it now, and I would be highly surprised if 100 years from now, we don't look back at what we do and say, yeah, everybody was wrong. Like all these people accepted this to a level that is inexcusable, and norms change. I mean, if I would walk into your university building or in your classroom and I would start to smoke, people around me would get up and say, are you completely crazy? What are you doing here? You're not allowed to smoke here. And we haven't reached this point in the publication system where somebody says, oh, by the way, yeah, I studied this in 7 studies and I could never find the effect. And then somebody says, so where's this published? And they say, yeah, I never wrote it up. And then everybody in the room gets up and says, what the hell are you doing here? You're not supposed to do this. We don't do this, right? So that's what I mean with norms on this level, that we accept this, at least for now, something that is, I think, really questionable behavior. And it can be excused on these individual levels. And I'm also not saying that, that people make the choices they make in many fields in life, right? You choose where you want to be based on your own beliefs about what's right and wrong. But yeah, I would doubt that this is acceptable in a long time. So do they selectively publish based on norms? Yes, I think so, right? I think the norm is we allow people to get away with it at the very least. It sounds very harsh, right? It sounds very harsh, I know.
Yeah, no, it's very good.
Yeah, we'll talk about this in 50 years, and maybe, maybe I'm misguided, or maybe in 50 years people will say, there was a time where people selectively published only that were crazy, right? I mean, who knows?
Hopefully it won't be that long. So the one that's getting quite a lot of attention is by Gordon with 7 votes. So registered reports invite criticism at an early time point. Would this be something that could a new norm you can get behind? Why not?
Okay, that's a nice question. I mean, I recently published a sort of column opinion piece about red team science. This idea where, and this is based on the current culture where even if you don't have a registered report, like in a registered report, yes, indeed, you get criticism very often to your own benefit, pointing out things that would prevent you from publishing something later or be a big flaw in any case later on. So helping you to prevent these, but also maybe, yeah, making just the research design better or addressing a question you might have missed, or, so that's a really nice thing about registered reports. Would this be something that could become a new norm? Well, I think it would be smart. So even if you don't use a registered report publication, from what we now see is that many people publish preprints, especially in this time with the coronavirus. People want to get their research out as quickly as possible. And we've already seen a number of cases. Like yesterday, there was this preprint about being able to predict the spread of the coronavirus based on some modeling they did, based on the sewage system, like samples they took from the sewage. And that could predict future a coronavirus increase or decrease in the population. This might be true, but what they also wrote is that their model predicted this with a correlation of 0.994. And everybody pointed out, like, whoa, this is crazy high, like nothing correlates 0.994. And the authors actually immediately responded and said, oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, this might be due to the smoothing functions we've used and stuff. We'll look into this. So people can immediately give you feedback and criticize you. At the same time, it was already too late for the preprint, of course. I mean, we can predict the spread of coronavirus through our poop. That's going to be picked up by the media immediately. So we don't know how well we can predict it at this point because, they have to redo the analysis. But if they would have invited this criticism, and this is what I call this red team. So there's a lot of software companies that have internal critics. So they have a larger collaboration, and a couple of people say, try to prove us wrong every step of the way. And I think that would be super interesting to try out, right? So we have some people that, and some people would like to do this. These colleagues, you have them, the people who love to be as critical as possible about something. Well, don't let them do this at the end when you've already collected the data and when you already fell in love with your results. No, do it as you decide to maybe even study a question, when you decide how to measure the question, when you decide the design, when you decide upon the analysis. So all these points, let somebody shoot at it, and then when you come out of your preprint, well, at least the 0.994 correlation has been filtered out. That's not going to happen anymore. So, yeah, could we make this a new norm? I think it would be great to try. Again, we probably need collaborations for this. I can't be my own critic in my own single author paper, but if we have a larger team, I would love to take turns with other people and try to do this every now and then. I would love this to become a new norm. Yeah, we need to become a bit better at accepting criticism, by the way. One nice thing that you see of people who have tried this red team thing in academia is they say, oh man, the first time I got so defensive. And I think that's something we need to train a little bit more, not becoming very defensive when you get criticism. And I think, yeah, we don't train our scientists well. So we would need to do this, but then it might become a new norm. Who knows? Would be nice.
Wonderful. Okay, so next one that's highly voted. What is your advice to early career researchers who were bullied, in quotation marks, by senior academics into following questionable research practices and do things this way because that's how it's always been done? Yeah.
I teach a lot of workshops, and this is always the question that happens somewhere at the end, where people say, this all sounds very sensible, but I don't think I can convince my supervisor to do this. And this sounds like an even more extreme case where a supervisor tells you to do certain things that are no longer considered good research practices. A first starting point would be to read your code of conduct, your scientific code of conduct. So I'm not sure how it is in other countries. In the Netherlands, there's, in the newest one, in 2018 one, there's a section that's really focuses on this explicitly, and it says if anybody in the research, like involved with the research in management, so this could be the supervisor, but it could also be the director of the institute, it could also be anybody higher up, forces somebody to disregard any of the preceding sections in this scientific code of conduct, then they are also violating the code of conduct. right? And I think that's true. So if anybody forces you to do this, it is in itself a violation of the scientific code of conduct. It would be in the Netherlands, and you would be entitled to go somewhere and say, look, this is my dilemma here. Am I crazy? You might be. Maybe it's perfectly fine. You don't know. You might be insecure about this. But I would at least invite somebody to discuss this with people involved in research ethics. So an integrity officer, for example, at the university. And this can be confidential, of course. I'm not saying you do anything. Another point is very often that people, and I'll also give one other example that's a bit more pragmatic. So sometimes people say, I really doubt that I would be able to complete my PhD if I gave pushback on this every step of the way. That's, of course, really, really problematic. But you are in a position that you can't solve this. Again, you can talk to an integrity officer, but it's not going to make the problem magically disappear. And even if they take action, it's unlikely to make it disappear before you're done with your PhD. So you'll be stuck with this problem. I think it is interesting to think about what would happen if everybody who has a problem with these bad research practices and being forced into these bad research practices, what if everybody who has a problem with this gets into a conflict so severe that they can't complete their PhD, if you really think it will be so severe. So there's a group of people who has a problem, makes it into a conflict, and they don't get their PhD. There's another group of people who think, oh, okay, if this is how it works, this is how it works, I'll do it. Then they continue on in academia. So if I have to choose between these two possible timelines, I'm not really happy with all the people who are upset about this dropping out of academia. And I think this is a real problem. So one thing is to document everything as well as you can. Get through this extremely problematic phase in your career. I'm pretty sure it will be highly stressful. Try to get through it, and then when you are more independent and can do your own thing, revisit those things. Because if the alternative is you dropping out of science, I would also be disappointed. So it sucks. It's a very problematic situation, but I would recommend maybe these two things, like revisit them later when you're able to, and talk to an integrity officer.
Okay, great piece of advice there. The next one is quite an interesting one because it's about large collaborations, and I know there's sort of a lot of advocation for collaborating. So this question is by Bradley, and a criticism that I've seen of large collaborations from global consortia is that it creates a scientific monopoly which pushes out scientists with opposing viewpoints. If you have to join and follow the consortia's viewpoints to get your research out there, does this prevent an individual researcher's ability to break the mold in terms of the current norms?
Yeah, this is definitely something that you need to think about as you establish a more collaborative science. I'm not saying an exclusively collaborative science. There's always politics involved in all levels. You would hope, again, and this ties back to this earlier question about red team science, you would hope that every collaboration has room for really the harshest critics and allows these people in an extremely transparent process to voice these criticisms, discuss them to a level that there's a good decision that's made in the end, even if not everybody's happy with this in the end. What you see in some other fields is that there's just variation in how people work. So there might be a large collaboration that's necessary to solve certain things and do it in a way that they think is best, and people who don't like these large teams and large collaborations. And in many fields, there's still room for these people to do certain research. They would have less resources, of course, than a combined group of people, but they're also free to create their own collaboration of people who agree with their specific viewpoints. So as long as there's room for this, and there continues to be funding for these different approaches up to a point where it's still scientifically justifiable, that is what you would like to have. So you don't want an exclusive collaborative science. And maybe my favorite example of this is if you look at CERN, which is a huge collaboration, thousands of people working together on this Large Hadron Collider. When they're now thinking about their next collider that they have to build, there is a different group of people working on a straight collider that has to be built somewhere in Japan. And that is one group of people who are saying, yeah, let's go for this. That would be the best thing to do next. And there's another group of people that says, well, let's just stay where we are. We just make a bigger circle, right? So there are different teams, and all of these teams get within the larger collaboration. They get time and money and resources. So these different ideas get room to be defended and grow, and then somebody makes a decision about what's really going to happen in some way. So I think that would be lovely if you can build in these different things within the collaboration. So when I talk about collaboration, I don't mean build in agreement or work on the same thing without criticizing. Good collaboration might even be like, okay, we don't really know what's the best, so let's develop things within the collaboration and work on different viewpoints, maybe opposing viewpoints.
Wonderful. So the next question is by Gordon. So what do you recommend for PIs who want to adopt justifying everything in their lab, but fear to disadvantage their PhD students because it is not the norm most reviewers are looking for?
It's not the norm most reviewers are looking for. I mean, so it could be that you propose something that is not typical at the moment, right? So you deviate from common norms, and that people say, well, I don't know this, so it must be wrong or something. So that could disadvantage people. So you have to make sure you give a good recommendation or a good justification that people can understand why you're doing something in a certain way. And I know that's very difficult. I have a colleague who often uses rush modeling in terms of measurement, and he always has to write his paper and then starts 2 paragraphs saying, okay, you're going to read something about rush measurement in a while. Trust me, this is really a good approach to measurement. No, it is not commonly used, but it is probably the thing most of us should be using. And then he has to have this sort of thing he goes through. And it is frustrating, and he has papers that are sometimes rejected for it, I guess, or at least have a hard time getting through, or he has to analyze it in the other way as well. So again, if you want to do this, maybe registered reports are good. You get this feedback before you did all the work. You can have a bit more of an interactive discussion with the reviewers and explain things together with the editor. So that might be an approach to do it. Yeah, in the end, innovation and breaking the norms has a certain risk of having to explain why you do this and why this is good. If you make good decisions, it should be possible. So there can be some disadvantage, I agree, but on the other hand, we hope that these new, the justifications lead to better choices. But I can totally understand if you do a new study, you say, okay, we justified our alpha level. Given our resources, we set our alpha to 12%. Yeah, that will be a tough sell, right? I'm not sure if it's easy to convince people that this is really the best trade-off, because otherwise your type 2 error rate would be much lower, and you miss risking out on finding something if it's there. But if you can really argue, yeah, this is a high type 1 error rate, so you have to be careful. We might be making a type 1 error, but at least we didn't miss something which is really important in this specific field, blah, 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 right? Yeah, so it's something we have to figure out, I think. But I wouldn't not do it because of this reason.
Okay, great. So just to let everybody know, speaking with Daniel before the talk started, we sort of agreed we would give people 15 minutes grace past the hour, but no more. So I will probably close the Q&A at 10 past. So get your last few questions and votes in. So the next question is, I think, a question of clarification. So. I'm a bit confused. I understand that a pre-registration does not automatically make the study better, but is there a justification for not jumping through this hoop? Does not it make the results more trustworthy, even if this was a pre-registration of a bad hypothesis tested using a bad method?
Yeah, I think practically speaking, I'm completely in agreement with this person. I think, practically speaking, it is almost academic to try to find places where writing down what you thought before you actually collected the data and does not make any sense. I could come up with some reasons. I could do a study, I could come up with a reason not to pre-register my analysis plan if there is really only one way that we analyze this data, and hundreds of people have done it in this way. And if you look at my experiment, I'm asking people, there are 2 conditions, and I'm presenting them with 1 picture, I'm asking them 1 question, and there's no other way that I could analyze this data for it to make sense, then why bother, right? Because it all follows logically from my experiment. So that's a situation where you would say it doesn't add anything, and it does cost a little bit of time to click through and go through the motions. So then you could academically, again, let it go. I think the more important point is actually the opposite side. So if you pre-register, it does not automatically make the study better. That is, I think, the point that I want to stress. So I'm actually not suggesting not to do it. I'm more saying don't misinterpret having pre-registered with making the study better. Indeed, it just makes it easier to see what happens. But practically speaking, I think almost always makes sense to write it up. But you could think of the level, right? Sometimes you might be doing something that you admit is so exploratory that, I don't know, then pre-registering, you're just, if you're honest, and you're just going to say, look, I'm not going to test anything. But definitely for a hypothesis test, I would say 99.9% of the time, practically speaking, it's sensible.
Okay, wonderful. So we have one from Roger Genus Sorolla. So it starts with a sort of a throat clearing and then it gets to the question. So he thinks heuristics are widely adopted because they promise to reduce not just uncertainty but disagreement. That is the idea that even though you may have different perspectives, you can in theory agree on a standard of evidence. The threat is that justify your X becomes self-justify your X. How important is the existence of shared norms for the practice of good and effective science?
Yeah, so it's a good point, and I definitely think there's a big benefit. And in some ways, it's almost amazing that as scientists across so many fields, we have established this, for example, 5% error rate as a threshold. It is almost amazing that we reached agreement on this, that everybody says, well, okay, this is a good minimum threshold. Let's just all agree on this. In a way, we don't agree with on a lot of things as scientists, and this seems to have reached agreement. And it is useful because it allows you to sort of say, okay, we're all doing this kind of thing, scientific process, and of course, more data is better. So yeah, if I spend my entire PhD 4 years to do one study, well, that would be a more informative study than if I do 4 studies in 4 years, right? So it is sensible to say, well, this is the minimum threshold of a scientific contribution, and we're going to base it based on this threshold of 5%. And in that sense, it's useful to have a lower limit of what we expect people to do. We have to trade off this benefit of having shared agreement about what we consider convincing enough evidence to make a claim. Right? I'm not saying publish it. We should publish everything that's well designed, but that allows people to say, okay, I'm making a claim, and the claim is based on the level that we all agree on. We have to trade off this against what's the downsides of doing this. So there are some benefits of having shared norms. I do agree with Roger. I think it's a good point. It makes things clear. Like, these are the rules that we play by, but they also come with certain costs. It can be very inconvenient to say, so you're now using this 12% alpha level, or for the koala example, you're using your 1% alpha level. Do I trust you? And it requires much more expertise of a reviewer to also be able to evaluate justification, right? So we don't not just need a context expert, but maybe in a while we'll need like 24 reviewers, and they all review this tiny thing, because on the other side, there were all these 25 experts that were contributing to this thing. Yeah, so that's also a downside, right? We need a lot of expertise on the reviewing side. And there, a standard makes the life of reviewers a lot easier. Just say, okay, you met this threshold and we agree on this. Yeah, so there's definitely a trade-off to be. And, you know, if I already quantified my justify everything a tiny bit, I'm happy to say that it is a bit of an extreme point that we should move towards more. But we should keep this part in mind as well. Like, how can we keep things operational and efficient for people? I'm not sure where it lies. I think we're too far on one side where we don't justify things, so let's give it a try.
Wonderful. So I've just counted. We have, I think, just over 10 more questions. So I have closed the Q&A now, just because otherwise you won't be able to answer them all. So the next question is from Johnny Coleman, and he says the red team concept works well in industry because the cost of redundancy is trivial compared to the benefits of success. That doesn't appear to be the case in academia at the moment. Does this have to be a top-down change from funders/employers, as well as, or rather than a bottom-up one?
Yeah, this general question of how do we change things bottom-up versus top-down, I think is an interesting one. I have to say I'm a bit more of a fan of top-down change than many academics who greatly value academic freedom, exactly because I think the choices that we individually make are not always the ones that increase the efficiency of science the most, but they also increase our own individual efficiency. So this is an interesting change. I think the red team, the red team idea needs to be evaluated against the costs. So I could also totally imagine that, you know, in some collaborations or some research questions, it's not necessary. But otherwise, I mean, there are two options. One is we just find the people who really love this, and I think we're luckily in academia where people like to be critical. There is a bunch of these people who say, "No, don't let me do new stuff. That's not my thing. That's not what I do best. But I can criticize other people. I can find flaws." We're trying out this red team approach now. We have a research project together with Mick Coles. He offered up one of his preprints for this, and there were many applications, and we randomly selected some. But I remember one of the applications said, if there are mistakes, I will find them. Like, I'm the person who doesn't. And I thought, I hope this person gets picked, and they were picked, so that was lovely. But some people like this. So that's our lucky side. So we might not even have to pay people too much. I mean, they might just be happy to contribute. On the other side, if they have to be, I mean, they have to be employed, of course, so we have to pay them. Somebody needs to pay these people. If it is within a research project, it's, of course, a weird trade-off to say, well, we're going to hire 7 people to do only this, and we're not going to hire a statistician or somebody who collects data, because those would be maybe much more valuable. So it's a trade-off there, but I don't think it needs to be uniquely hired people. I think it would really be a good start if within the team, within a meeting, you just say, okay, you're now the devil's advocate, right? That's another name for it. You're now the devil's advocate. Instead of brainstorming with us, you're brainstorming against us, and let's see what we can do. So that would be a way to incorporate in a smaller scale. Otherwise, whether this needs to be a top-down thing, I'm not completely sure. It would really need to prove to be very beneficial to be a top-down thing, as opposed to something like data sharing, which I think we can have top-down as a top-down requirement because the benefits are clear enough.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm all for a sort of Elizabeth Big, Nick Brown scholarship fund of trying to foster these sort of people that really enjoy looking at issues with data. So the next question is a bit of a long one, but I'll just try to. It starts again with a bit of a throat clearing. So, do you believe that part of the problem with journals being hesitant to accept articles with non-significant results is that too often researchers report them as no effect, when in reality many studies, at least in my field, non-significant results are simply representative of underpowered, inconclusive studies? Could more widespread use of equivalence tests that allow the null hypothesis to be accepted help convince journals to publish studies that show non-significant results? That's almost like a planted question there, Daniel, but I don't think it is. Yeah.
No, I definitely think that we want these null results to be informative, just like we want our significant results to be informative. We have the tendency to give both of these sides not due consideration. So if it's significant, we say, well, I guess your manipulation worked, because otherwise, why would you find a significant result? We use this a lot. My background is a bit in priming research, and then we would prime something, but we couldn't measure if we actually primed something. We just assumed that this step happened, and then we measured the thing, and finding it was proof that your manipulation was fine. But maybe it was like a confound or a demand characteristic. So we were too easy on significant results and saying, no, this was informative. You did what you did. Same thing for non-significant results. Very often we say, yeah, what do we learn from these? Well, in a study where indeed you use something like an equivalence test or a Bayes factor or a rope procedure where you accurately estimate the effect within a certain equivalence range, if you agree beforehand that this was an informative study about a question, and you make sure that the data is highly informative about where the effect size is more or less, it should be published. So it should help at least with some types of dismissals of null results. And in practice, I think we see this. So sometimes now we have these very large registered replication reports where you see 2,000 participants being collected by 20 labs across the world. And then if they say, no, we didn't find it, we do think that's an informative null result. And of course, it would be nice to have something in between having to collect 2,000 participants across 20 labs and allow single researchers to make the claim. It doesn't seem to be as big as at least was argued before. So it would be one way, hopefully, to make them easier to publish. I agree.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. We still have a few questions, but we'll try and get through them. So this next one is, what do you think about the possibility that personally justifying everything can also do harm if the quality of some scientists' reasoning for what, some scientific reasoning for that would do worse than just following a minus norm due to, e.g., limitations in methodology, understanding, or a specific view about how science works?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of things, we shouldn't accept any justification, right? We should challenge the reasons behind this justification. I also think that we will see that there's a number of ways to justify certain things in the future, and people would then just refer like, okay, we used this procedure to come to a decision about this thing, and this procedure has been well vetted, right? So I'm not saying justify, but just say, we thought it would be fun to collect 7 participants and then go on a 2-month holiday instead of spending 2 months data collection. So that's our justification. I'm not saying that should fly. So I'm not too worried about the justification. I'm more worried about not having a justification and assuming it's fine. But then if you actually look at whether it is valid, we have problems with it. I think that a justification has the benefit of making the reason behind something transparent, and it actually makes it easy to say, no, this is not a good justification to do something. Hopefully, maybe it's a bit too optimistic, but that's what I hope will happen.
Okay, wonderful. So next one is, so do you think there could be scientific norms that the public disagrees about, but are still justifiable?
Of course. I mean, I don't think the public in general, like science is not supposed to be a democracy, right? It should be based on very good justifications after intensive debate about what is a good practice or not. So I'm also happy, and maybe this was referring to the question about publication bias. So it's not that I think because the general public said researchers should be fired if they selectively report, now the general public was right. My main point there is it's so interesting to see the huge divide in how one side thinks this is perfectly fine and the other side thinks you should be fired. I'm not saying either side is fine. I think firing is actually a bit extreme. But it does provide some input for something to consider. And if there's a concern, we should be able to explain why this is not how it works. So I'm more than happy if somebody writes a paper and says, well, you think everybody who selectively reports that's a bad job. Well, in this range, you're actually making a good point. In this range, not. So let's say, you did a study and you had a temperature measurement, and afterwards it turned out that the temperature thermometer you used is broken. Yeah, you don't need to publish that result, right? It's no result, but you don't need to publish that as far as I'm concerned. You can redo it in the future. So there will be a range of findings where we cannot publish. So the public is not the end justifier of how science should be done. No. But they can, they are working from a different framework. And I think something that's nice, sometimes people say, if you really can't convince somebody in the general public, like a well-intentioned person, of a procedure, then you also have a problem. And that I think is the case with publication bias. I find it very difficult to justify this for a member of the general public, that science works like this.
Wonderful. The last few questions, I've just read them and there's quite a bit of overlap. So I've selected one which I think you could cover, but I mean, I think you've covered most of this already in the talk and in your writings elsewhere, but this could be a sort of summary statement. So you talked about building new norms from an understanding of the underlying scientific questions. What strategies can we undertake to defend those new norms when they run counter to the old norms, for example? For example, if you have a solid reason to use p less than 0.04 in a study, you might expect to encounter a lot of resistance in disseminating that data.
Yeah, this is a nice question. I think maybe, I can make one point I didn't make so far, which I think is interesting, is that I think we should have much better scientific discussions. So I posted this like a tweet a while ago where you had two of these people in suits who are mascots for some, I think, hockey game or something, and they were sort of fighting it out, like doing a battle against each other. One was doing their little dance, the other was doing their little dance, and it was supposed to be more impressive, and then they just both walked away because they had done their thing. And many scientific discussions are like this, and we've done this, like the should you use the lower alpha level? Should you justify it? I mean, we both did our little dance, we published in these nice journals, and then we walked away. Right. And now we left everybody watching like, yeah, this was fun to see, but now what? So we really need for other people to be able to say, no, I'm not just picking sides here, because now you can choose. You can say, oh, no, I'm just not using a significance test at all. I'm using a justified alpha. I'm using a lower alpha. You could pick. And that's also undesirable. So what we should do have better discussions, not let people walk away afterwards, lock them in a room, make sure that they reach some sensible statement for people who have to use this. So we just have discussions, people move away, and I find it extremely unsatisfying. Whereas I think that if you dig in, there is way more agreement than disagreement between these different sides, which doesn't really come through. And I think unless you are part of these discussions or really think about it for a long time, you don't notice. So the discussions now don't point out the disagreement that's already there, and it doesn't force the people who are having the discussion to go through the motions. I once had a very nice meeting between Bayesians and frequentists in Germany, and it took 2 days, and there were 6 talks. And then after every talk, there was like, I don't know, 2 hours of discussion. And that was perfect. Everybody could say what they wanted to say, get their specific viewpoint out, but then people would just keep asking questions like, okay, so but how about this and how? And after 2 days, everybody was sort of like, yeah, no, okay, it's fine. Yeah, we agree on the on the bigger thing. Well, if we can do that in 2 days, then I think we could do it. But you have to really get people together, put them in a room, and let them talk it out. And we don't do this. So that would be maybe the way to establish new norms. If people disagree, send them on a cruise ship together, and 2 months later they can only get off if they reached agreement and communicated.
Or they get coronavirus by being on a cruise ship. Well, Daniel, that brings us to the close of the talk. The really wonderful talk, and it's nice that we're reaching a point of maturity now to actually be reflective and self-critical of the initiatives that are trying to be self-critical of the current norms. And it's great that you're kind of leading the discourse in that direction. Thanks for your time. I know you have a meeting in a few minutes, so I'll let you pop off. What I will do is I will end the live stream, and you can stay on the line, and then we just wrap up and debrief. So thank you again, Daniel, and I hope you're well and safe and well.
Thanks for all the questions. It was very nice to do. Thanks.